Hello! Today I'm taking a look at a unique facet of battle dynamics and story within the Final Fantasy universe. The history of summonable beings in this series is interesting, and their inclusion and importance in core story has grown exponentially as time wears on. Starting initially as commodities to find or purchase in the form of material or items, or actions available exclusively to summoners in the battle screen, each numerical installment of Final Fantasy has incorporated these beings to an increasing degree, and they've grown from subservient guardians, as seen in earlier games, to creator gods that oversee and dictate the worlds of men in Final Fantasy XV. Now, Square's penchant for religious and folkloric symbolism and naming conventions is also prevalent among the summons, with staple creatures such as Ifrit, Bahamut and Shiva taking their influence from Arabic and Indian folklore, and also oddities such as Carbuncle, which is a lesser term for red gemstones, Titan, which is a race of beings that fought against the Greek gods on Olympus, and Leviathan, which is an aquatic beast found in the Hebrew Bible. And each of these, and more, periodically grace the universe of Final Fantasy, and particularly the summonable creatures. To this end, Square's reimagining of these mythic creatures is part of their appeal, and their shifting aesthetics and cutscenes is always a sight to see, and often a bragging of the graphical capabilities of respective console generations. And digressing slightly, I may dedicate future episodes to certain significant summons, such as Bahamut, Shiva and Ifrit, for example, as this clip is designed to be more of an overview of their collective progression. So, the introduction of summons was a gradual thing, and although Bahamut does feature in the first numerical Final Fantasy, he's not summonable, and it's really only Final Fantasy III and Final Fantasy IV that sees this become a tangible battle command and element of the story. The majority of Final Fantasies, and thus general consensus, regards these beings as summons in terms of terminology, but it's worth noting that 6 and 12 refer to them as espers, 9 and 13 call them eidolons, 8 calls them guardian forces, 10 aeons, 11 avatars, and 15 astrals, and 14 primals, I believe, as well. So the general etymology around each of these terms generally hinges around Latin phrases for paranormal or ghost-like phantasms. So they all correlate across each respective title to a generally universal meaning. Just taking a step back on this point and looking at Japanese media in general, it's interesting to see the recurrence of summonable or companion beasts in their entertainment exports. Pokemon, Digimon, Monster Hunter, Ni no Kuni, Death Note, and Naruto, just to name a few, all feature or hinge around beasts, creatures or beings that can be called to the hero's aid, which is quite an interesting thing that's particular to Japan. And kind of dwelling on this and thinking about it, my opinion, I think it could relate to Shintoism, which is, it forms the spiritual and societal backdrop for Japanese culture, and focuses on a belief in spirits called kami, which are imbued within everyday things such as rocks and forests and water. And this reverence of nature and animism, along with other aspects of Eastern folklore, such as tales about the many yokai, which are phantoms, that were popularly depicted in Edo period art, and fairy tales, may account for the recurring creatures which we see in Final Fantasy and wider Japanese media. And I think it's worth noting for the context of these games and wider media in general, because I've never really heard anyone discuss why summons are such a prominent facet of Final Fantasy, and I think it could relate back to this cultural backdrop, which we don't really consider when we look at things like Pokemon or Digimon or Final Fantasy. So this is doubly interesting because when we look at Final Fantasy, we generally see Norse or Greek or Arabic creatures and naming conventions featured in the games, but their context and function as summonable creatures is rooted firmly in this uniquely Japanese facet of entertainment. Now, back to Final Fantasy, and starting with Final Fantasy IV, we saw the uniqueness of the summoner class being introduced, which persists intermittently in games as both a job class and an aspect of the story. Final Fantasy IX, where the summoners are a race of people, and 10, where the summoner is a position of great importance within the Church of Yevon, exemplifies how the importance of the role of summons and the summoner has grown, and also, interestingly, how there's often a special status ascribed to characters who can commune with these beings in the temporal realm. So this is correlative to real-world cultures and history, particularly if we look at oracles of ancient Greece, who were revered for their ability to, emote with the gods, which is interesting because, the oracle is also a term that's been used for Lunafreya and her status within Final Fantasy 15. And we also have things like shamans found in Native American cultures, for example. So there's this distinction of people that can commune with spirits and commune with, certain supernatural creatures that Final Fantasy draws upon quite heavily as well, I think. Jumping to Final Fantasy VI, we see the next step in evolution for summons, where they are introduced to core story, and the espers, as they're known in 6, are harvested to construct magitech weapons for the Gestalian Empire. And we soon find that they are an entire race of creatures living in the Esper world and are being constantly hunted down by Kefka. And in this context, the Espers inform the story of Terra, who is half human, half Esper, and the themes of duality. And I've discussed this previously in my Final Fantasy VI review. And this, dualism is explored through this hybridity and clash of culture and race between the Espers, the summons, and the humans in this game. So, returning to my earlier point about the status of summons within the Final Fantasy games, in 6, they are basically treated as slaves and commodities and subhuman creatures that are, basically being harvested and killed off by this ruthless empire, which is killing them off for their own scientific and technological purposes. So, despite the mysticism and the power of the Espers, they are basically powerless against this push of science and technology, which is something I think they carried over and explored in the themes of Final Fantasy VII, where we have Shinra mining the life stream, which is and because the Shinra and the life stream is such a prominent part of Final Fantasy VII, it's actually one of the few games where the summons take a back seat and aren't really important to the story at all, other than being, materia objects that can be can be equipped by the party. Moving into Final Fantasy VIII, the Guardian Forces took a much more prominent role in terms of the relationship to humans, and also their role in the story and battle dynamics compared to 7, as I've mentioned, junctioning. So in Final Fantasy VIII, we see the roles reversed compared to 6, and humans are basically, they have to implore and prove their worth to these creatures in order to win their allegiance. Much like the Shinto spirits I mentioned earlier, many GFs inhabit particular elements and areas of the game, such as Ifrit being in the Fire Cavern. The brothers are in the Tomb of the Unknown King, and Odin is in the Central Ruins. And in this context, Squall and his party must often endure a trial by combat to prove their worth to these creatures. Ifrit, Odin, Bahamut, Diablos, Cerberus, Cactua, and Tombury, all of these are obtained by fighting them directly. And the dialogue of those first 5, upon starting the battle with them, all of the summons that can talk in this game, they request that the character prove themselves worthy. And similarly in this game we have Gilgamesh, who I've spoken about recently. But Gilgamesh appears to test Cypher's prowess before kind of joining Cypher as a GF. We see him in the battle kind of test Cypher, and Cypher obviously fails badly. But it's this very interesting dynamic where the GFs have the power, and for them to ally themselves with the party or anyone, they must be tested by combat first. So this is an interesting context to find summons in compared to their earlier renditions, and their challenging nature is on a par with the trials undertaken in Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XV, where the characters are required to prove their worthiness to these increasingly omnipotent deities, which have shifted now thoroughly from subservience to mastery of man across the span of these games. Final Fantasy VIII is also unique in that the character designer Tetsuya Nomura wanted these beings to be more beast-like and animalistic than we've seen in previous games. And the obvious changes we see is that Ramu has been replaced by the Aztec influence god Quetzalcoatl, and Titan is replaced by brothers, and also finally Ifrit, while still a summonable GF, he becomes much more of a beast-like creature rather than a humanoid in this game. Turning to Final Fantasy IX, this game is interesting because where the summons have traditionally developed consciousness and personality, culminating in Final Fantasy VIII, they revert back to somewhat amoral manifestations of myths and memories in Final Fantasy IX. And I believe in the Ultimania it explains that the summons are the manifestations of myths and legends that the dead people have told each other in life, and then they manifest for summoners as these respective creatures. So that's quite interesting. On the other hand, however, you could argue that it takes a step back from giving them personalities, and much like the genie and the lamp in Aladdin, these creatures are basically at the mercy of the whims of whoever chooses to summon them. So instead of like Final Fantasy VIII, where they have some sort of moral or at least physical strength standard and you have to prove yourself, the summons here, in the 3 core cutscenes that we see in Final Fantasy IX that feature summons, we have Brane, who summons Atomos to destroy Lindablum. She summons Odin to destroy Clara, and attempts to summon Bahamut to kill Kuja, which ultimately fails. So the eidolons in Final Fantasy IX don't really have a say in all of this, and there's no semblance of personality or moral compass apparent in them, apart from one short segment where we speak to Ramu at Pinnacle Rocks. And while I wouldn't say that this aspect of summoning is bad, and I don't think it's bad game design or poor writing per se, I just think it's something that's unexplored that they could have mentioned or discussed directly, in the game events. And in defence of this, it's finally worth noting that, the eidolons in Final Fantasy IX, traditionally in the universe of Final Fantasy IX, they reside exclusively within the summoner tribe at Maiden Sari, and are summonable only by people like Garnet and Eiko, who are attuned to them through nature and tradition. The intervention of Zorn and Thorn and Kuja, and the brutal extraction process which takes place in the game, which is clearly against the natural order of things, can probably account for eidolons being used for evil ends in Final Fantasy IX, and why they have no say in the matter, because perhaps they can only communicate directly with summoners such as Garnet, which would account for their lack of characterization in the hands of Brane, which I think is quite plausible, but I just don't think that was explored in game, as I said previously. So moving to Final Fantasy X, the aeons characterization becomes a hybrid of their appearances in Final Fantasy VIII and IX, which is to say there's a cloister of trials, so there is this sense of having to prove one's worth to obtain them, and Yuna often implores their assistance in battle, which shows a sense of deference to them, from their human counterparts. But much like in IX, there's very little discourse or sentience about the summons themselves explored in the game. And, aside from some infrequent run-ins with Bahamut's Faith, who takes the form of a small child, and Seymour's mother, who is Anima's Faith, we don't really have any communication or conversation, with these aeons and any personality they might have. In terms of the wider story, however, in Final Fantasy X, the aeons, or at least acquiring the aeons, are extremely significant parts of the game. And the defeat of Sin, which is the main antagonist and creature in the game, it traditionally hinges around the summoner being able to acquire and use these aeons, and the institution of Yevon hinges around the preservation of the temples of these aeons, and raising summoners to fight this never-ending battle with Sin. So in this context, the aeons are ingrained in the culture of Spira, and rather than being a distant or archaic force that are unique and important only in battle and to our party, by contrast, everyone in the world of Spira is aware of and in reverence of these summonable creatures, which is an interesting facet of Final Fantasy X's universe that I think is best exemplified by when Yuna first summons Valefor, at the beginning of the game when she comes out of her first cloister of trials, and the whole village are around, witnessing the aeon and celebrating that. So it shows there's a very public and universal awareness of these creatures, which we don't see in any other game up until about Final Fantasy 15, I'd say. Final Fantasy 11 and Final Fantasy 14 are games that, admittedly, I can't elaborate on too much, as my first-hand experience with the MMOs is limited to playing 11 about 10 years ago. However, each MMO installment sees the summoner role and the nature of the more mission-based MMO format render summons as a more pragmatic and optional reward to obtain. And the nature of the summoning aspect is based on job class progression and player choice, rather than the necessity of a wider story. And this extends in part to Final Fantasy XII, which has only 5 espers which we acquire by the main quest, and the rest are an optional acquisition via side quests and player interest, really. 12 also radically departs from the canonical range of summons seen up until this point, and instead rooted itself in the Ivalice setting and the zodiac symbolism which we have in Final Fantasy Tactics. As such, we have anomalies such as Belias replacing Ifrit, and I remember many audiences being quite affronted by this transition at the time. But for my part, and in retrospect, I felt that the uniqueness of 12's setting and the art design and even the gameplay dynamics could plausibly rationalise the replacement of these beings, and if nothing else, the Zodiac-inspired summons actually augments the significance of the Ivalice setting and the universe within the wider numerical franchise. Speaking of radical departures, the forever controversial Final Fantasy XIII turned the summons into some godlike robot mechs that understandably divided audiences and proved a radical departure from basically everything we've seen them portrayed as before or since. But regardless, it maintains this consistency of them as guardians for those who need them. And this is quite interesting because the storyline makes them become these personal guardians rather than general ones to which anyone could possibly be worthy. Now, finally, I want to shift on to the most recent instalment of Final Fantasy, and one that elevates summons to their most prevalent status yet in terms of story and setting. The astrals of Final Fantasy XV have personalities and extended backstories that position them as gods among men, and beholden to no one except perhaps for the crystal. In fact, contrary to earlier games where summons are usually supernatural beasts we need to defeat and tame to call upon, the astrals of 15 are temperamental and often despair of humans, with particular examples being Leviathan and Ifrit, the former of which completely loses it and attacks Lunafreya upon being woken, and the latter, Ifrit, being a cynical deity whose prologue terms him as fickle as fire, and he has a very love-hate relationship with mankind in this game. Now, those who listened to my piece on Ardyn or Noctis will know that I felt that Square relied heavily on Abrahamic and specifically Christian influences in terms of narrative in this game. And this extends to the Astral Gods too, with some core comparisons being made here. Firstly, Shiva's dialogue about how mortals were made in the image of the Astrals. This pretty much paraphrases Genesis 1:27 at the beginning of the Bible, wherein God makes man on the 6th day in his own image. And Shiva's basically taken that verbatim and said it about the Astrals. And secondly, we have the backstory of Ifrit and his animosity towards mankind and the 5 other Astrals, which culminates in the War of the Astrals, which I find very similar to the War in Heaven, which saw the Archangel Michael cast out Satan, and in a similar fashion we have Ifrit betraying his fellow Astrals and being cast out by Bahamut. So, the godlike status of the summons in this game is matched only by their physical stature, and upon first seeing Titan, who's practically a mountain, we are introduced to this sense of scale that they have compared to the human beings. And though you might regard this as purely aesthetic, I think it's very symbolic of how they've transitioned, at least for this one game, into creatures that surpass mortals rather than serve them. And regarding the backstories, some interesting context is offered in the Book of Cosmology and the wider lore in Final Fantasy XV, which again sets these summons apart. Their origins and personalities, particularly around Ifrit, contextualize certain elements of story and gameplay, and particularly how and why Ifrit comes to become the penultimate boss rather than one of the astrals we're able to summon, which is of course tied into Ardyn, the Star Scourge, and primarily the fallout of the War of the Astrals in the backstory. So there we have it. I think the summons are a fascinating accompaniment and extension of wider Japanese entertainment in the context of Final Fantasy, and their consistent presence but shifting visual appearance and role within the narrative of each respective game continues to evolve and, more often than not, impress people when it comes to each new release. So let me know what you think. Drop a comment and start a conversation, and if you like what I'm saying, of course please hit subscribe, and thanks for listening.